Officer Thierry, hearing all the commotion from his post, just one half block away, ran down Mulberry Street and quickly responded to the gunfire. He arrives on the scene, firing his revolver at Arresto. Got two shots off that missed the kid. The kid responds immediately to the shots fired at him by firing back. With one shot right in the gut, and Officer Thierry dropped to the ground. The autopsy released by the coroner's office revealed that Officer Heaney was shot 3 times with a .38 caliber bullet. Officer Thierry was shot once with a .32 caliber. Rizzo was killed with one shot. That was a .38 caliber bullet. The kid knew the heat was really on now. He ran back into the hallway at 241 Mulberry Street, where he lived, and then disappeared right into the night. It was speculated that this is where he washed off the blood and changed his clothes. Through the backyard, up tenement stairs, and along the rooftops, back downstairs and to the train station. I personally can relate to this because I used to climb those roofs, as I said, as a youngster. And I could see him climbing down there and probably winding down toward what is now Lafayette Street, but then was called Marion Street, and making a walk or a run to the IRT subway. Anyway, that's my memory of the street and the building, 241. Pandemonium struck Mulberry Street Station. All officers from Mulberry Street Station were called in to the scene. Some officers tended to their fallen friends. Other officers had cordoned off the crowds. Others were questioning Italians in the crowds. And yet other panic-stricken officers rushed to Mulberry Street House at 205 Mulberry Street to put a call to St. Vincent's Hospital to save their fallen brethren. Lieutenant Sullivan quickly ordered all reserves from the Mulberry Street Station to report for duty. After a short while he realized the gravity of the situation, hurried to a telephone and sent requests for all reserves in the great city south of 14th Street to report to Mulberry Street. This was in the New York Times, by the way, on May 4th, 1913. Others tending to Officer Thierry heard very little from the fallen officer and couldn't get an idea of what happened. Thierry was weak and struggled speaking, but pushed through his pain to speak, but his words were incoherent. Father Gill from St. Patrick's Church at Mulberry Street saw the shooting from his rectory window and ran to the scene. He began administering last rites to Rizzo and Officer Heaney, evidently seeing the dire condition of both victims. All 3 men were admitted to St. Vincent's Hospital. John Rizzo, 35 years old, of 41 Spring Street, was pronounced dead on arrival. He was out on a $2,000 bail at the time of the shooting for shooting at Taylor from Brooklyn. Patrolman Charles Thierry, 36 years old, of 633 Greenwich Street, was pronounced dead 2 days after arrival at St. Vincent's Hospital. His widowed mother and brother, fire captain of Company 43 in the Bronx, were at his side when he died. A police funeral was given with full honors for the 12-year veteran. Of the hundreds of witnesses, not one would admit seeing the occurrence. Only Father Gill, the priest at St. Patrick's Cathedral, would admit seeing the fight and shots. But of course he admittedly could not see or identify the shooter. He would run to the scene and administer last rites to all victims. I can relate to Father Gill because I, as an altar boy and later growing up in the neighborhood, slept in the rectory, and even from my window at 247 Mulberry Street, I had a full view of St. Patrick's Old Cathedral and church, as well as partial view or full view from my fire escape if I sat outside of the rectory. So I can appreciate what Father Gill must have seen at the time. Again, the New York Times reported on May 4th, 1913, and I quote, "At 12:30 o'clock this morning, Mulberry Street All of Mulberry Street was in an uproar. One policeman and an Italian gangster lay dead on Mulberry Street, while another policeman lay seriously wounded at St. Vincent's Hospital. Police reserves were brought in and rushed into the district from all stations south of 14th Street. The chief of the Detective Bureau showed up himself on the scene and dispatched his detectives all throughout the Italian quarter of Manhattan to find the murderer. There were no shortages of theories on who committed the crime, why it happened, and how it happened. Officers and detectives were already mixed in the crowd trying to find answers. After 1 hour of scouring the crowd, still not one person on the scene would admit to seeing what happened. Mulberry Street was jam-packed with crowds that numbered several thousands. Crowds came from all over directions and were held behind the police lines even past 1 a.m. The New York Times again mentions slays a policeman and a gangman, May 4, 1913. Detectives from the department theorized that there were two shooters because of the accuracy and deadly effect of the crime. Yet others theorized it was a crack shot gangster from one of the dangerous downtown gangs. And thus the two-shooter theory arises. The coroner asserted that two men must have done the shooting. They held Ralph Laredo on charges of being the second gunman. Detectives arrested Pedrugo Tipaldi due to his resemblance to Arresto. The policeman knew better. Their theory was that this was an expert gunman that carried two guns, one caliber to kill at a distance, one caliber to kill close up to the victim. Respect was the name of the game, of the gangster game on Mulberry Street. Anytime, anywhere, any place a gangster was disrespected, it would not be tolerated. As we know, kids are not genetically caught up in the gangster life. They learned it from the streets, and some even learn it at home. You can't learn this stuff at school or church. You just can't decide to be a gangster when you're 30 either. You got to start early. Arresto wasn't a big guy. Newspaper and police profiles show him standing at 5 foot 1 3/4 inches and only 125 pounds. But guys twice his size would fear him. Hell, his confidence would lead him to believe that a whole army of Sicilians couldn't take him down. He was strong. He had muscle, and he knew how to fight. But most of all, everyone knew he had balls. They knew even if they beat his brains in, he'd come back looking for you, and you wouldn't stop looking till he found you, and he wouldn't stop looking, really. You got to think like that to survive on Mulberry Street. It's mostly a mind game. He thinks like a crazy man, and they think he's a little crazy. But as a matter of fact, crazy he wasn't. He was a hardened criminal with real business sense. Arresto not only sold guns, but was an expert with automatic pistols. Arresto knew that the seed was planted. It grows in their mind, and then, and only then, is when they fear you and respect you. Nobody wants to mess with you. Without that respect on the streets, you're done. You might as well break yourself and sell apples out of a cart. Respect, that's what kept Arresto and his family alive till now. Nobody messes with the family or the family business. Arresto knew that these poor coppers were just working the beat and doing their jobs the best they could. He certainly had no thoughts of ever killing a cop. It was his impulse reaction to being hit, and being hit so hard, the welt behind his ear was still prevalent 6 weeks later. He loaded down the crooked bull brass that gave the poor B cops orders to do one thing. Things were real simple back then, in the early 1900s, for the family. There was a code of the streets and the rules with the bulls. That's it. Follow them. The code was respect. The bulls were, kill your own and we leave you alone. It worked for a long time. Even President Theodore Roosevelt knew it worked. At that time, actually, President Roosevelt was police commissioner and stationed at 300 Mulberry Street. But even he couldn't manage all the criminality that was going on at the time on Mulberry Street. Even if codes were broken for arrest or for the family, violation of the code meant an irrevocable death sentence. Passes are not an option. Most Sicilian guys give passes, have votes, got to get an okay from this guy or that. Not us. You're dead, plain and simple. No judge, no jury, just the hangman. Now, Arresto knew death sentences were bad for business. So did the family. They didn't need or want the interruption. Everyone knows the code and the rules. They know that they know what the consequences are. And if they violate them, there is no remorse at all. They're just enforcing the code. It was just Arresto's job. It's just what he did. Unfortunately, the only thing they respect on Mulberry Street is if you didn't put a gun in their face, and they'll walk all over you. That's not going to happen to an enforcer. He tried to keep everything clean. People should have known better than try him on for size. The mindset that everyone who tangled with him had it coming. One thing everyone knows around Mulberry Street, don't mess with the family or you'll end up nailed up in a pine box. People knew it. It had been known that blasting someone never bothered Arresto either. He was described by most Sing Sing officials as one of the most dangerous stone killers to be housed in their fine establishment. Bottom line, in the streets of New York City, someone messes with you, then you got to show them the hard way. I'd like to mention at this point some point that I recalled reading about Mulberry Street, the Killer's Block, in 1913. I first became aware of the Paper Box Kid from an article I read in the New York Daily News a long time ago. From time to time, the paper featured a justice story. One story that caught my immediate attention was Escape from Sing Sing, because in the first words were Mulberry Street between Prince and Spring Street, which was where I lived. Reading further, I learned that this mobster shot another mobster and two policemen 3 doors down from where I lived, and after giving himself up, was sent to Sing Sing prison where he escaped after killing another guard. This piqued my interest to the point that I began researching the story. I will describe what I learned from my family and my research about this unique mobster and the murders that occurred within 50 yards of Mulberry Street. But again, I'll mention John Silitani's unique book, Gangster Original. In fact, in the book, he cites Mulberry Street block with the people who lived there, and I like just to run down it because it's so familiar to me. As I said, the odd numbers were on the west side of Mulberry Street, like 247, 245, 241, and the even numbers on the east side of Mulberry Street. 260 to 264, I could view from my 247 apartment 10 window where they nabbed John Gotti, St. Patrick's Old Cathedral and Church. 263 Mulberry Street was the cemetery. 247 Mulberry Street, where I lived, and then I realized from researching this thing that it was a funeral parlor before it became the Ravenite and the Alto Knights. It was a funeral parlor, and it was run by a Neapolitan gangster named Theodore Palumbo from 1910 to 1924. In fact, one of my uncles remembered it and was citing it to me. He was known as the funeral director of the Stiffs. He would sew them up as they got shot on Mulberry Street, as I recall. 245 Mulberry Street was the low tenement house owned by the Shillitanis. 243 was Vitaco's grocery store, tenement, again owned by the Shillitanis. Witness Nellie DiCarlo was a tenant witness to the shooting who lived at 243. 241 Mulberry Street was Giannano's Bakery. The tenement owned by Shillitanis was a 6-story tenement, and it was Michele Oresto's father's building and home. .236, I might mention, across the street, even number, was Latone and Cadetti Funeral Parlor, a very busy place in 1913. In fact, as a youngster, I remember Larry Latone and Paul Cadetti, the funeral directors, because I was still living at the time as they were. And Larry Latone was a friend of my dad. At any rate, 235 Mulberry Street was the pool room, which had the grand opening of the Parados Cafe. Again, a tenement owned by the Shillitanis. And 233 was a cafe saloon tenement, again, owned by the Shillitanis. Oresto was here before storming next door to challenge Rizzo. I also might mention, lastly, 232 Mulberry Street, which was an even number building across the street from where I lived. And it was the home of Agnello Della Croce from 1914 to 1960, the Gambino underboss. Moving on, let me comment about what my family members witnessed during the murder. And it would be with an interview with my uncle Joseph Frezza, who's passed on now. But as a background, let me say this. My mother and her family, the Frezzas, lived across the street during the 1900s from 247 at 250 Mulberry Street. I was told that my grandfather started the Alto Night Social Club, which eventually became the Ravenite Social Club. The Frezzas at that time were a family of 10, my grandfather, grandmother, my mother, her 4 sisters, and 3 brothers. Most of their pictures appear in my original memoir entitled 247 Mulberry Street. The evening of the shooting in 1913 caused most of the families in the nearby buildings to come to their windows to see what was happening. My mother and her family heard the shots and remember the commotion on the streets with the police, the crowds, the bodies. As a matter of fact, my uncle, Joseph Frezza, actually remembers what happened. He spoke with the baker's son the next morning at the scene where the shooting occurred. I interviewed my uncle more than 50 years ago, and he related to me what he remembered about the events leading to the sensational murders that took place on Mulberry Street in 1913 within 50 yards of 247 where I lived. In cross-checking what he remembered with my research and John Shillitani's story, it is amazing how accurate it was. I will cite the interview with my uncle here for the purposes of comparison to what actually happened as reported in the newspapers at that time, and later in Escape from Sing Sing article by Joseph McNamara, which I mentioned previously. I'm also including a couple of comments from my uncle's older sister in terms of what she remembered. So, beginning with the interview with Uncle Joe during the 70s, early 70s, in which he relates events leading to the murders which took place on Mulberry Street in 1913. I'll start it. Thinking back now to 1913, how long would you say the incident with Morgan and his gun occurred? Uncle: well, the year before that, Johnny Rizzo, Kid Morgan, was firing shots at one of my father's drivers, you know. So we opened our windows and we started throwing bottles. When did this take place? It was a Sunday a year before that. Well, who was throwing the bottles? My family, yeah. Then other people started hollering, Then naturally he ran away. Because at that time the police used to come around fast in those days, They heard a shot. There were so many shots involved, see? And this fellow Rizzo ran away? Yeah, he threw the gun away. He lost the gun. The gun belonged to Shields, And then they had the breakup. They had that argument. That was the excuse about the gun. They had that argument that night, and he shot him. Then he shot 2 cops. But you told me that a lot happened before that with the store to make him jealous. Well, before that, his father put up a little store for him at 241 Mulberry Street, and he didn't go partners with Johnny Rizzo, meaning Chilatani, or Rizzo rather. Johnny Rizzo took a place on 46 Prince Street, see? And the 2 stores kind of wound up faring with each other, And then there was animosity that caused them to be like enemies, And the father was steamed up about it. You get that guy to pay for the gun and this and that, He steamed up the son, and that thing happened like that, see? And that was the main reason that the murder happened as you remember it? There might have been other reasons too, but that was the main reason. That was the motive. You could see that it was a good motive there for it, And then, is there a thing that you can recall after that? For instance, why did Nellie DiCarlo testify against him? Well, she was living right in front of the building where it happened, She lived at 241. Or at 243, rather. She was right there. But she liked Rizzo, you told me. Well, I would say that she would have preferred him. But she had a witness. But she was a witness, that's all. She testified. She was a spirited girl, She must have had a reason for it. Or she would have denied she had seen anything, She was a star witness there. Do you remember the day the shooting happened? Yeah, it was a Saturday night or Sunday. Yeah, in the morning when I got up and I went down the street, and there was a kid there, the baker's son there. They used to be out there late at night at that time, He said, I know who did it, I said, yeah, who did it? And he told me it was Harry. I said, oh, yeah, because a lot of people who knew were out there that night. Did you hear? Yeah. They were having a grand opening a couple of doors away. A Jewish Calabrese that opened up a bar there, They were having a grand opening there. That's where Johnny Rizzo was. They called him out there. Where was there? What? What the hell could it be? 235, 239? It was just a few doors away. It happened at about 12:01 o'clock in the morning, something like that. Well, what happened when he broke out of Sing Sing several years later? His brother was going to have a car waiting for him. Yeah, to pick him up. But they never got there. Why? They heard a siren. They ran away. But he was told there would be a house there if the car wouldn't make it to run him into that house. He should run into that house. And he ran into a hospital instead. He thought it was the house? Yeah, he thought it was the house. Where did he swim? From one side to the other side. With no clothes in July? The weather must have been favorable then. Did you remember after the funeral any animosity among the cops? Well, yeah. Well, what happened? They used to get out at night. They got along with them. Half of them were stool pigeons anyway, But you started the basis of their banding together to protect themselves. What started it? The mafia. Yeah, well, because they did it among themselves, Then they spread out a little. They organized to protect themselves. Yeah, they were organized then. There was a Sicilian group, the Calabrese group, but they weren't organized. But they got organized. They made it all one thing, And there was a connection to Sam Zelig. In a way, Zelig shook down everybody. First, he shook down the Jews. He was a Jew. And then he shook down the Italians at that time. The Becker case came along, the Rosenthal case, Well, at the end of my interview with my uncle, and I asked my Aunt Carrie, who was his older sister, what she might have remembered about the shootings that night. And I asked her, what happened that night in 1913? Aunt Carrie, what happened? I don't know. What can I tell you? We all jumped up. We were by the window. That I know. But as far as the excitement, the people, we saw them okay. I remember seeing them holding and dragging the cops, They were shot. They had to pick them up from the floor. And sure, those policemen, they were always on the corner, one corner here, one corner there. Naturally, they must have heard the shots. They came. They were young fellows. I don't know how old. End of interview. I'd like to conclude by referring again to the Escape from Sing Sing article by Joe McNamara, which started with Mulberry between Prince and Spring Street. A month after the shootings, in the face of enormous police heat, Shilatani surrendered to New York cops. He was convicted in 1914 to die in the electric chair for the murder of Heaney, and at his trial it was emphasized that he also killed Thierry and Rizzo. It was also revealed that the slaying grew out of lending of a pistol to Rizzo by Shilatani. Rizzo had used the gun on the striker and threw it away afterwards. Shilatani wanted to be paid for the piece. Rizzo refused. For 2 years, Shilatani's case was on appeal, and he gave Sing Sing officials no particular trouble. But when the Court of Appeals upheld the verdict and Shilatani's execution was set for the first week of July 1916, the slayer became frantic. Lodged in Sing Sing's old death house, he was just feet away from the little green door through which killers went on their way to eternity. Under this setup, changed in the new Sing Sing, those on death row awaited the hot seat could hear everything that went on in the room of execution. The sound of the saw. Also by law, after execution, the victim's cranium had to be removed and his brain examined. This required a little saw work, and it was accomplished in a small autopsy room near the doomed men. The sound of the saw unraveled them, according to Dr. Amos Squire, chief physician at Sing Sing for more than 30 years. About a month before Shilatani's scheduled execution, Roy Chaplin went to the chair, and another person, Giovanni Supe. The sounds of execution and autopsies following the turndown of his appeal apparently unhinged the young felon, I should say. He tore up his cell and had to be sedated. At that time, the chief physician at Sing Sing was the sole judge of a doomed man's sanity. Now, Shilatani played the wacko, but Squire would not buy his game. Shilatani was incensed. He snarled at Squire, "You'll get yours in 24 hours." Unknown to the doc, Shilatani had a pistol and ammo in his cell and could have used them, but he had other plans. About midnight, June 21, 1916, Shilatani asked guard Daniel McCarthy for a slop can. At that time, the death cells had no indoor plumbing. As McCarthy opened the cell door with a pail, the prisoner shoved a pistol into his abdomen and fired. Shilatani dragged McCarthy into the cell and with his keys locked him up. Or locked him in there, we should say. 2 guards, hearing the commotion, came to McCarthy's aid. One was shot in the arm, and both were locked in cells. Shilatani, in his underwear, slipped into an exercise yard, placed a 10-foot long bench against the wall, and scurried over. He scaled a high fence and leaped into the Hudson River. However, that night, Shilatani became confused. He swam south instead of north. A Confederate in a car, hearing the prison sirens wail as a breakout was discovered, drove off in panic, and the escapee could not find clothes that had been left for him by the river. Spotting a light, Shilatani, pistol in hand, entered a building. It was Ossining General Hospital. One night nurse was on duty. "Oh, you must have some dry clothes," she said. "Wait here and I'll get them for you." She had heard the shriek of sirens and knew their message, but she was calm. She came back with one shoe. "What good is one shoe?" Shilatani exploded. "I'll get another," she said. "I can't wake anyone." Shilatani was infuriated. By dribs and drabs, the gutsy nurse assembled a wardrobe of sorts, taking time to phone authorities from upstairs. "I think the escaped prisoner is downstairs. I'll try to hold him for you." And hold him she did until guards walked in and arrested Shilatani without a struggle. Back in his cell, Shilatani told Squire that he had anticipated getting a sedative from the good doc that evening, and that if he had, he would certainly have killed him. McCarthy died, making Shilatani a 4-time killer. On June 28, 1916, New York Governor Charles Whitman refused a reprieve, and Shilatani reported to his maker at 6 a.m. June 30th. As he sat in the hot seat, Shilatani said, and I quote from the article, "I'm sorry that unfortunate man, McCarthy, died. He grabbed my gun, but I am innocent of the crime I am accused of." End of the story of murder and mayhem on Mulberry Street